A birthday always seemed like the perfect occasion for warmth and family harmony. But this year, things didn't go as planned. Josh received an unexpected call from his boss, and instead of spending the evening with me, hurried off, leaving me to handle the guests alone. I was surrounded by kitchen chaos and last-minute preparations. Alex and Lena arrived first. Alex looked tired. His usually vibrant gaze was dimmed, and he silently took a seat in the armchair, avoiding conversation. Lena, on the other hand, was lively and immediately began helping with the table, though her remarks came off as sharp comments. "You always rush to do everything yourself? You know, help can actually be useful," she quipped. I smiled politely, trying not to take it to heart, but irritation bubbled inside me. I served the wine, and while passing Alex, I accidentally brushed against his hand. It was a fleeting touch, but an electric jolt ran through me. I glanced at him. His eyes met mine for just a second, but there was something in them I couldn't decipher. He quickly looked away, as if it had all been a mistake. The celebration continued, but that moment lingered in my mind. The laughter, conversations, and toasts around me felt like mere background noise to something new, something I couldn't quite name yet. As the evening wound down, Alex unexpectedly offered to help clean up. His tone was neutral, but I felt that this was more than just a polite gesture. As we cleared plates, each time our hands came close, I felt a strange tension sweep over me. "You look tired. Maybe you should take a moment to relax," he said. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. That simple phrase felt too close to what I actually needed. That night, I was left alone, questioning myself in ways I hadn't before. The dinner started with light chaos. Clinking glasses, the hum of conversation, and bursts of laughter created a festive atmosphere. But inside, something felt off. Josh sat in the corner of the table, barely participating in the discussion. He was glued to his phone, occasionally throwing out short phrases to avoid seeming completely detached. Lena, as always, was at the center of attention, her loud voice filling the room. She talked nonstop, engaging everyone, but her remarks weren't always friendly. At one point, she leaned closer to me and with a sly laugh said, "Ellie, have you noticed how Alex looks at you? Like you're the main gift of the evening." My heart raced and I involuntarily glanced at Alex. His gaze was indeed fixed on me, but he quickly looked away, pretending to be focused on his plate. A warm flush spread across my cheeks. I tried to change the subject, asking Lena about her work, but the conversation faltered. Unexpectedly, Alex stepped in to help. "You've really mastered handling this kind of chaos, Ellie. Organizing events like this seems to be your true talent," he said, his tone genuine, not just polite. I nodded, mumbling something in response. His attention made me more self-conscious than I wanted to admit. I felt exposed under his gaze, as if he saw more than my words or gestures revealed. Meanwhile, Josh remained engrossed in his phone. His detachment stung more than any of Lena's comments. As dinner wound down and guests began to leave, Lena said her goodbyes with a smile, leaving us with a mountain of dirty dishes. Alex stayed behind. "I can help clean up if you don't mind," he offered, standing up from the table. His voice was soft yet firm, as if he understood I needed more than just help with the dishes. I nodded, feeling a small sense of relief from his support. That morning, I had to go grocery shopping. Josh was busy, and I decided to manage it alone. Alex offered to help, saying it would be faster that way. I didn't object. The drive was mostly silent. Alex focused on the road, calm but carrying an unspoken heaviness. I stared out the window, trying not to think about last night or the strange tension that had settled between us. We parked near the supermarket. I opened the door to get out, but Alex suddenly spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and it unsettled me. He didn't look at me, but his words cut deeper than they should have. At first, I tried to dismiss what he said, but his calmness, the certainty in his tone, made me think. He didn't raise his voice, but each word echoed in my mind. At one point, he placed his hand on my waist, pulling me closer. The movement was unexpected, but not abrupt. I didn't have time to react. It all happened so fast. His lips touched mine, and for a moment, time stopped. The kiss lasted only seconds, but it felt like everything inside me had shifted. The sudden intimacy left me shaken. I pulled away, my heart racing like I'd run a marathon. We both understood something unacceptable had just happened. The drive back was silent. I stared at my hands, feeling them grow cold with tension. Alex sat beside me, his gaze fixed on the road, his fingers gripping the wheel tightly. When we arrived, I quickly got out of the car, muttering a brief thanks. There was no conversation. There couldn't be. After the trip to the supermarket, everything changed. I tried to avoid Alex, but he always seemed to be around. Every time I moved to another room, he found a reason to be near. It wasn't deliberate, or at least I hoped it wasn't, but the tension was unbearable. Lena couldn't ignore the changes. She had always been observant, and her sharp gaze during dinner that evening made me uncomfortable. She sat with her chin resting on her hands, watching Alex's every move. Her silence was heavier than any comment. Alex had changed too. He seemed nervous, as if he could feel her suspicions. Whenever our eyes accidentally met, he quickly looked away, but Lena noticed everything. A few days later, the tension reached its peak. Lena chose her moment carefully, waiting until everyone was in the living room. Her voice cut through the silence of the room, louder than necessary. "Alex, don't you think you're spending a bit too much time with Ellie? It's starting to look strange." I felt the blood rush to my face. My heart stopped, then started pounding wildly. I couldn't find the words to respond, but I couldn't stay silent either. "Lena, stop," I blurted out, but her eyes gleamed as if she had been waiting for this. Alex stood up abruptly. "Lena, enough. You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice restrained but filled with warning. She didn't stop. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about. It's obvious to anyone with eyes." Alex couldn't hold back any longer. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the walls seemed to shake. I sat frozen, trying to catch my breath. Lena leaned back in her chair, triumphant. The silence that followed was unbearable. After the incident in the living room, the house was filled with a heavy silence. Alex had disappeared, but his presence lingered in every corner. I tried to focus on daily tasks, but everything felt off. Late at night, my phone buzzed. A message from Alex. "Ellie, we need to talk. Please, I need to explain." I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. A storm raged inside me. Common sense screamed that this was a bad idea, but something darker pushed me toward meeting him. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town where no one would recognize us. Alex was already seated at a table by the window, clutching a cup of coffee. I approached cautiously, my legs trembling. He started speaking immediately, his voice low but filled with tension. He admitted he couldn't stop thinking about me, that these feelings were tormenting him. He talked about how he had tried to suppress them for so long, but now it was beyond his control. I listened silently, but inside I didn't feel what he described. For me, this wasn't about emotions, it was something else. It was the desire to break free from routine, to taste the forbidden fruit, to feel a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I looked up at him. His eyes were filled with emotion, hope, fear, guilt. I understood that this meant a lot to him, but for me it was simpler, more primal. When the conversation ended, we stood. Alex seemed like he wanted to say more, but I stopped him. We both knew the line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. Outside, a cool breeze blew, and I felt his hand briefly touch mine. I pulled away quickly, but the sensation lingered, like a trace. We walked off in opposite directions. After the cafe meeting, I felt different. Tension built inside me like I was standing on the edge, and any step could be disastrous. Josh, usually absorbed in his own world, suddenly began to notice the change. "You've been distant lately," he said one evening, sitting beside me on the couch. "How about we have a night just for us? Watch a movie, order pizza." His suggestion caught me off guard. I couldn't remember the last time he'd made such an effort. I nodded, trying to hide my unease. But the evening with Josh didn't go as he hoped. I was physically present, but mentally elsewhere. His attempts to spark conversation fell flat, and eventually, he just stopped trying. Meanwhile, Alex's behavior became increasingly strange. He avoided unnecessary conversations with Lena, but his tension was impossible to ignore. Lena watched him closely, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Have you seen the way he looks at you?" she suddenly blurted out during dinner. Her words hit like a slap. I pretended not to hear, but her smile made it clear she knew exactly what she was doing. Lena's words only deepened my guilt, but they also ignited something inside me. Alex, too, was affected. That evening, when I stepped outside to get some fresh air, he approached me. "I can't do this anymore, Ellie," he said, standing beside me. I didn't respond, but he continued. "Things can be different. Give me a chance and I'll change everything." His voice was steady, but I saw desperation in his eyes. At that moment, I realized I was standing at a crossroads I could no longer avoid. The house needed decorating for the holidays, and I decided to dedicate the day to it. Josh left for work, leaving me with boxes of garlands and candles. Alex offered to help, and though I hesitated, I couldn't refuse. We started in the living room. Alex brought down boxes from the attic while I hung garlands. The atmosphere was tense, but the silence seemed to suit us. We each focused on our tasks, though I constantly felt his eyes following my every move. At one point, I asked him to help place the star on top of the tree. He stepped too close, his hand brushing mine as I handed him the ornament. The fleeting contact was like a spark, igniting something that had been smoldering for weeks. When he stepped down from the ladder, we ended up standing almost face to face. The silence between us thickened. I felt his gaze, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. His hand lightly grazed mine, and I realized that if he took one more step, I wouldn't be able to stop it. But the step never came. The loud sound of the front door opening startled us both, and we pulled away. Josh walked into the room, his expression indifferent, noticing nothing unusual. I exhaled, trying to appear natural, but the tension lingered. Meanwhile, Lena wasn't far away. She overheard our conversation about the decorations, but judging by her expression, she picked up on far more than necessary. Later that evening, alone with Josh, she decided to act. Her voice was deliberately calm, but there was an undercurrent of alarm. "Have you noticed how strangely Alex has been acting? I think there's something going on between him and Ellie." Those words were the beginning of what I feared most. The tension at home had reached its breaking point. After Lena's remarks, Josh began watching me more closely. He said nothing, but his gaze, heavy with suspicion, was harder to ignore than any direct question. When Alex suggested going out to shop for gifts, I agreed immediately. It was a chance to escape the suffocating atmosphere, even if only for a while. We got into his car and the drive began in a thick silence. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur past, but my thoughts kept circling back to the events of the past few days. Alex was quiet too, his focus on the road. The silence was finally broken by his voice. He spoke suddenly, evenly, but there was bitterness in his tone. "Sometimes it feels like we're not living our own lives, just following what others expect, playing by rules we didn't make." I didn't respond, but something inside me shifted. He continued, his eyes fixed on the road. "You feel it too, don't you, Ellie? Like something inside you has been gone for a long time. I can see it." His words made me turn to him. He didn't meet my gaze, but I noticed how tightly his fingers gripped the wheel. He seemed so sure of himself, and it made my head spin. Then, without warning, he placed his hand on my knee. The movement was smooth, almost casual, but it sent a wave of heat through me. "No one will know," he said softly, his voice steady. His hand stayed on my knee, warm and searing, making me forget everything that was waiting for me at home. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, but I couldn't. The moment was too powerful to resist. By the time we reached the store, I realized I had already made my decision. Shopping for gifts felt like a blur, and I could hardly remember what we picked. Alex stayed close, saying nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. When we got back into the car, he suggested stopping at a hotel. I nodded, my heart pounding. This wasn't just an escape from reality. It was a step into the unknown, one I couldn't refuse. The car turned off the main road, and I knew everything was about to change. We stopped at a small hotel tucked away from prying eyes. My heart pounded as Alex booked a room. It was a moment of complete uncertainty, but I knew there was no turning back. When we entered the room, the silence between us grew heavier. Alex closed the door and turned to me. His gaze was steady, yet there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He stepped closer, unhurried. His fingers brushed against my face, slowly trailing down my cheek. My breath hitched as his hands gently wrapped around my waist. "Ellie," he said softly. lowering himself to his knees in front of me. The gesture was both bold and tender, as if he was offering himself completely while exuding quiet confidence. His hands slid along my thighs, pausing for a moment, and I realized I had never felt anything like this before. He stood, moving even closer. Our lips met, tentatively at first, as though testing whether we should cross this line. But within moments the kiss deepened, growing more fervent, obliterating any remaining doubts. His arms tightened around me, pulling me closer. His touch was firm yet gentle, filled with both passion and restraint. My fingers tangled in his hair, and in that moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. Time seemed irrelevant. There was only us and the sound of our ragged breaths. When all boundaries were fully crossed, a brief stillness followed. We sat together on the bed, hesitant to speak. Everything was clear, there was no going back. But the moment didn't last. As we left the hotel, I noticed a flash. A faint light, but bright enough to catch my attention. We turned, but there was no one there. A lingering sense of unease followed me as we returned to the car. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had seen us. When I returned home, everything seemed surprisingly calm. Josh was sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee, engrossed in a book. Normally, he appeared relaxed in such moments, but now his composure felt unsettling. He looked up as I walked in, and his smile seemed too even. "You were gone a while. Everything okay?" His tone was casual, but I sensed a hidden tension. I mumbled a vague response and hurried upstairs. I needed to change clothes, but more importantly, I needed a moment to collect myself. Everything that had happened at the hotel lingered heavily in my mind. The line we had crossed couldn't be ignored. Later, as I tried to focus on mundane tasks, I noticed Alex avoiding my gaze. Of course, Lena didn't miss a thing. She watched both of us intently, as if she were searching for evidence to confirm her suspicions. "Don't you think Alex has been acting strange?" she asked when we were alone. Her voice was innocent, but her eyes glinted with concealed curiosity. I brushed her off, pretending not to understand her meaning. By evening, the tension in the house reached its peak. Josh appeared calm, but there was something unnerving in his demeanor. I didn't know that he had already assigned someone to keep an eye on me, supposedly for my safety. Josh had never mentioned it, and I hadn't suspected his growing doubts. But the situation had taken an unexpected turn. That person witnessed Alex and me entering the hotel. I would learn this later, but at that moment my instincts warned me that something wasn't right. Finally, Josh broke the silence. "I thought we could all relax a bit. Tomorrow evening, let's have a family dinner, just the four of us." His words sounded like a sentence. A chill ran down my spine. Could he already know? Inside, I began to realize that my secret was no longer under my control. The family dinner started off tense. Josh sat at the head of the table with the demeanor of someone fully in control, while Alex looked as though he was ready to snap at any moment. Lena, on the other hand, exuded a strange satisfaction, as if she was anticipating something only she knew. I tried to act natural, but the utensils in my hands trembled. Josh noticed and slowly set down his glass. "Ellie, I have a gift for you," he said, his smile cold. He pulled out an envelope and handed it to me. My fingers shook as I opened it. The first thing I saw were the photographs. Me and Alex, the hotel, images of us entering and leaving hours later. My heart pounded in my ears as the world around me crumbled. "What is this?" I whispered, though the answer was clear. Josh stood. "It's the truth, Ellie. The truth you tried to hide. I hired someone to protect you, and instead, they showed me who you really are." His voice grew louder. "You betrayed me." I couldn't speak. Alex shot up from his seat. "It's not what you think, Josh. It's not like that." Josh turned on him. "Not like that, Alex? You walk into a hotel with my wife and it's not like that? Then what are you doing here?" Lena let out a quiet laugh, and it was the final straw. "You knew?" Josh turned to her. Her smile faded, but she didn't reply. The room turned into a battlefield. Josh shouted. Alex tried to explain, but his words only made things worse. Lena looked as though she had finally gotten what she wanted. I couldn't take it anymore. Standing up, I felt my legs tremble beneath me. "Stop! I can't," I said before running out of the room. The cold night air hit me, but I didn't care. I ran without knowing where I was going, feeling only one thing. I had destroyed everything. I stayed in a small hotel on the outskirts of the city. The room was modest, almost bare. A bed, a table, curtains that blocked out daylight. It was the perfect place to hide from the world. The family dinner replayed in my mind over and over like a broken record. Josh's words, his anger, the photographs, they left a deep wound in my soul. I kept trying to understand how I had ended up here. Was it my weakness? Or was it that I couldn't bear the emptiness that had consumed my marriage? Images of Alex flashed through my mind. His touch, his gaze, the moments that had felt so right at the time but now turned into regret. But was it true regret? Or did I only regret the consequences? On the third night I spent there, I heard a knock at the door. Walking over, I peered through the peephole and froze. Alex. His face was a mix of guilt and desperation. "Ellie, I know you're in there. Please, open the door," he said, his voice muffled but firm. I stood motionless, unable to respond. My body felt paralyzed. Alex knocked again, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. He waited for a few minutes before I heard his footsteps retreating. I returned to the bed and sat down, staring at my phone. There were no messages from Josh, but his silence was more frightening than words. The next day, a courier arrived at the hotel. He handed me an envelope. I knew what it was before I even opened it. Divorce papers. Inside was an official notice. Josh had initiated legal proceedings. I held the envelope in my hands, feeling a hollow emptiness settle inside me. He hadn't even tried to talk, hadn't given me a chance to explain. The world I had tried to hold together had finally collapsed. Alex insisted on meeting. He called me in the morning, and a few hours later I was sitting in a small cafe near the hotel, trying to appear calm. But inside I was shaking. He walked in, glancing around as if unsure he should be there. When his eyes met mine, I felt the same familiar spark, but now it was accompanied by the weight of guilt and bitterness. Alex sat across from me, and for a few minutes we sat in silence. Each of us seemed to be searching for words that could make this situation even slightly easier. "Ellie," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but I could hear the tension in it. "I ruined everything. I never wanted it to end like this. But I have to know, did it mean something to you?" I lowered my eyes, feeling tears well up. "It did mean something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But it's not something that can continue. I've made too many mistakes. I can't destroy my life, or yours, for something that may not have a future." His face twisted with pain, but he nodded. "I never wanted you to feel this way. I wanted to be with you. But maybe I was wrong." The words caught in my throat. I wanted to say things could have been different, but that would have been a lie. We both knew there was no going back. He stood, his movements slow as if his body resisted each step. "I'm leaving," he said, looking me in the eyes, "and it's the best thing I can do." When he left, I remained at the table. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I didn't try to stop them. Everything I had done had led to nothing but destruction. But I knew this wasn't the end. I couldn't let it break me. I had to gather what was left and start over, alone perhaps, but I would fight for my life. The apartment was empty. For the first time in weeks, I was alone, and the solitude crashed down on me with its full weight. I sat on the couch, hugging my knees, staring out the window. The city lights flickered outside, but all I could see was my reflection, tired, lost. The drama of recent days had left deep scars. I thought of Josh, his cold words, and the way he had closed the door on me forever. I thought of Alex, his parting words and the pain in his eyes as he walked away. Had I made the right choice? Was all of this worth the life I had now, fragmented and barely held together? The idea of leaving, starting fresh, came to mind often. A new city, new faces. It seemed like the only way to forget everything. But every time I began planning, something stopped me. Maybe I was just afraid of making another mistake. Weeks passed. To keep myself together, I took a job. It was a simple position, but it gave me a sense of purpose, however small. At one of the events, I ran into Josh. He looked different, distant, almost like a stranger. Our conversation was brief, strained. "I hope you're doing well," he said before mentioning that there was someone new in his life now. I nodded, trying to stay composed, but inside it felt like a knife had been driven into me. After that encounter, I spent a long time at home processing my emotions. It hurt, but maybe it was supposed to. One evening, I received a message from Alex. He thanked me for everything and said he was moving to another city. I read his words over and over before finally deleting the message. It was his way of leaving for good. And maybe it was the best way forward for both of us. I decided to stay. The city that had witnessed all my mistakes would now be the place for my new beginning. I looked at myself in the mirror and, for the first time in a long while, saw strength instead of weakness. A few days later, I found a letter in my mailbox. It had no return address, with only one question written inside. "If you could do it all over again, would you?" I stared at the letter for a long time, but I couldn't find an answer. The apartment that once felt like a refuge had now turned into a prison. I spent days sitting on the couch, staring out the window for hours. The streets outside were full of life, but I felt separated from it by an invisible wall. Depression, like a slow wave, overwhelmed me completely. Every time I tried to pull myself together and move forward, memories dragged me back. Josh's face as he handed me the envelope with the photos. Alex's voice filled with hope and pain. Lena's smile, which now seemed mocking. I often thought about how I had created this situation myself. No one had pushed me into these mistakes but me. My desire for something more, my thirst to break the monotony, had been enough to destroy everything. Each day began the same. I looked at my phone, checking for messages that never came. Josh no longer wrote, and his silence was worse than any accusations. Alex had disappeared as suddenly as he'd arrived, leaving only emptiness behind. I tried to find meaning in work, but even that felt pointless. Every attempt to return to a normal life shattered under the weight of guilt. In the mirror, I saw a woman who had nothing left to lose. One day, unable to bear the weight, I took a piece of paper and wrote, "You created this problem yourself. You destroyed your own life." The words were simple, but they carried the entire truth. I left the note on the table and stared at it for a long time. It was the first time I fully admitted my guilt, and perhaps it was the first step toward leaving it behind. Sometimes life brings everything you've done back to you, just in a different form. And I realized, this boomerang, I had thrown myself,